This is the Freedom and Reason podcast. I'm Andrew Austin. Today I want to contextualize the impeachment and trial of President Donald Trump. It's a long story stretching back to the aftermath of World War II, which means that I will have to leave out quite a lot of detail. However, one has to grasp the context if one wants to understand why the Democratic Party and the corporate media are behaving the way they are. One has to understand the enduring character of the ruling establishment, the national security state, and the military-industrial complex to grasp why the Democratic Party, why the corporate media would strive to remove a president from office. Quoting Charlie Kupchan, who served as special assistant to President Barack Obama, "A big part of our diplomacy was pushing the Ukrainian government to clean up the corruption, partly because it was that corruption that allowed Russia to manipulate the country politically and economically." Kupchan is professor of international affairs in the School of Foreign Service and Government at Georgetown University. He is also a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. In his capacity as a representative of the executive branch during the presidency of Barack Obama, Vice President Joe Biden threatened the Ukrainian government with withholding military and other aid and loan guarantees if it did not fire prosecutor Viktor Shokin. During a 2018 speech at the Council on Foreign Relations, Biden bragged about withholding $1 billion in appropriations in order to force the Ukrainian government to address the Shokin problem. What was the problem with Shokin? Burisma Holdings, Ukraine's largest gas company, had secured special permits from the Ministry of Ecology and was under investigation for this. Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, had been given a cushy job on the board of Burisma, paid millions of dollars despite having no experience in the industry. The new prosecutor, Yuri Lusenko, initially confirmed the narrative at the core of the so-called conspiracy theory advanced by President Trump and his attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Allegations of widespread corruption involving Biden and other Democrats, but then recanted his story before resigning. As president, that office in charge of enforcing law and carrying out policy, Trump asked President Zelensky to look into the matter. At the same time, the Trump administration put a hold on $400 million of military aid to Ukraine. For this, Democrats accused the president of abusing the power of his office. One interpretation of these events was that the president was using the same tactic Biden had used, namely withholding U.S. aid from the Ukrainian government unless it investigates corruption. Democrats articulated a different interpretation. Because Joe Biden is running for president, Trump's actions were self-interested, since he, and his party along with tens of millions of other citizens, seeks re-election. One might ask, why does Biden's decision to run for president grant him immunity from an investigation into his involvement in a country known for corruption? Furthermore, if Trump is to be impeached for interfering in the 2020 election by investigating Joe Biden for corruption, then what shall we do with Democrats who are interfering with the 2020 election by investigating a sitting president? This question becomes even more pressing in light of the fact that the aid was delivered to Ukraine and no investigation of Biden occurred. In other words, no crime occurred, even if we suppose that all of this constituted a crime. The de facto claim by the GAO that the Impoundment Control Act applies in this case is false. It no more applies here than it applied in the actions of the Obama administration when they took action withholding aid to Ukraine. There is nothing here. And when a person is being prosecuted for no crime, for nothing, one has to ask why. Emerging from World War II, the U.S. established the national security state, which involved several developments, one of which was the creation of the CIA with the National Security Act of 1947. Another was the reorganization of the national military establishment in 1949, renamed the Department of Defense, absorbing the three cabinet-level military departments. These changes were made to pursue a Cold War against the Soviet Union and its allies, since presumably another hot war would prove unpopular in a war-weary world. But really because the capitalist class stood more to gain from these arrangements. An East-West polarization hiding a North-South reality. The strategy was known as containment. It led to the United States and some of its allies on the one side, and the Soviet Union and some of its allies on the other, to amass vast nuclear arsenals for mutually assured mass destruction. The United States then embarked on decades of proxy wars to carry out containment, to keep the world safe for capitalism. Thus, we see the development of a vast military-industrial complex that today consumes more than 60% of the United States discretionary budget and is shaped by interest streams flowing in and out of it, which in turn shapes everything else. Let's be clear. The military-industrial complex was the work of the Democratic Party, and the social logic of hegemony was what we call Cold War liberalism. Cold War liberalism combined with progressivism to perpetuate the capitalist mode of production in the post-war era. The Cold War was a war that was never meant to be won. Recall the words of George Orwell from his dystopian novel 1984, penned in 1949. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces, or pouring into the stratosphere, or sinking to the depths of the sea materials which might otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable, and hence in the long run too intelligent. The lives of elites are dedicated to world conquest, but they also know that it is necessary that the war should continue everlastingly and without victory. By becoming continuous, war has fundamentally changed its character. In past ages, a war, almost by definition, was something that sooner or later came to an end, usually in unmistakable victory or defeat. Continuous war helps to preserve the special mental atmosphere that a hierarchical society needs. The war is waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of the war is not to make or prevent conquest of territory, but keep the structure of society intact. During the 1950s, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Republican, was president and became quite concerned about the war establishment, warning the nation in his farewell address in the councils of government, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together." John Kennedy came to office in 1961, and in a round of addresses to various chambers of commerce, he announced a plan to restore high levels of profit to corporate America by slashing taxes on the wealthy and corporations and opening the United States to competitive market forces. The fall in the rate of profit had come about because of the power of organized labor in securing for the working class a significant portion of the surplus produced by that class in the form of redistributive taxation and social programs, as well as major investments in public infrastructure and education. Kennedy was assassinated before he could carry out the plan, but his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, upon assuming office, pushed Kennedy's plan through. His administration and the Democratic majority in Congress also eliminated the immigration quota system that had helped build the era of domestic prosperity, opening borders to allow the influx of cheap labor to undercut organized labor domestically. To further the globalist agenda, Johnson ramped up the Vietnam War, the argument being that it was essential to containing communism that the nation pursue war in Southeast Asia. This was Cold War liberalism at its peak, and the stage was set for the neoliberal restructuring of Western societies. However, the social movements of the 1950s and 1960s had produced a consciousness that nourished anti-war sentiment. And by the 1970s, the establishment became nervous about the ability to continue permanent war, and thus the ideology supporting the vast military-industrial complex that allowed the capitalists to keep the world open for the level of exploitation it believed necessary for maintaining high rates of profit and the accumulation of ever more money capital. Frustrated with the anti-war sentiment, frustrated by the fruits of the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, indeed the socialist movement, elites developed a vast network of policy-making foundations and institutes, pulling into its orbit previous foundations and institutes, and plugging the network into governance structures. Thus, to thwart an even more thoroughgoing social democratic order, groups like the Trilateral Commission were established. The Trilateral Commission played a special role. It manufactured a candidate for president, Jimmy Carter, and staffed his White House to return the Democratic Party to its Cold War liberal stance, which elites felt it had misplaced. Carter worked from a manual, The Crisis of Democracy, which called for a return to the traditional authority structures and a reinvigoration of the American empire. The director of the Trilateral Commission, Zbigniew Brzezinski, organized Jimmy Carter's national security apparatus, which involved a major proxy war in Afghanistan, a country in which we remain mired to this day, initially intended to drag the Soviet Union into its own Vietnam war-like quagmire. But Carter was inept and lost an embassy to Islamic terrorists in Iran, and because of this, his bid for re-election. When his successor, Ronald Reagan, assumed office in 1981, the Cold War liberals, the Scoop Jackson Democrats, after hawkish Washington Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, left the Democratic Party for the Republican Party, enticed by its muscular Cold War posture and an expansion of the military-industrial complex. Reagan, with the help of his vice president and former CIA director George H.W. Bush, organized numerous proxy wars, most notoriously his war on the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, which you may know as the Iran-Contra scandal. The administration also fed a devastating war between Iran and Iraq. When Bush came to power in 1989, amid a collapsing Soviet Union, he launched the Gulf War, hailed by the media, especially CNN, which ran wall-to-wall coverage and sang the glories of Western military intervention. In the war's aftermath, the coalition of capitalist nations implemented a harsh sanctions regime carried forward by President Bill Clinton during the 1990s. It also fell to Clinton to deal with the question of NATO. Since NATO was created to fight the Cold War and contain the Soviet Union, with the Soviet Union gone, NATO was reconfigured to serve as a forward-leaning aspect of the military-industrial complex in its explicit globalization project. This reorganization was punctuated with the bombing of Serbia. Thus, the antagonisms with the East were never resolved. During this period, an organization was formed called the Project for a New American Century, or PNAC, by a team of neoconservatives. Neoconservatism is rebranded Cold War liberalism, with roots in the 1960s and 70s, admirers of the principle, peace through strength, a slogan, really, adopted by Reagan. Indeed, this was the same crowd of people who came out of the Democratic Party those many years ago. They desired to topple Saddam Hussein in Iraq in order to trigger a democratic tsunami, euphemism for a new era in colonialist collaboration in the Middle East. When George W. Bush became president in 2001, he put PNAC central to his foreign policy team. Indeed, the Bush administration became the vehicle for the neoconservative agenda, and within a few years, the United States military invaded Afghanistan and then Iraq, setting the stage for the democratic tsunami that would be carried out by Barack Obama. Barack Obama was particularly important to this project. As a man with a black identity, an Arabic name, having spent his formative years in Muslim culture, he provided the consensus-building element that was so necessary to tamp down the anti-war sentiment that had been growing again in response to Bush's wars, which were supported by the Democratic Party establishment, with Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden at the forefront. The establishment was determined to not have happen again what happened in the 1960s and 70s. No more pacifism. No more class consciousness. Elites promoted identity politics over against individualism, cultural pluralism over against a common culture, replaced the principle of equality with equity and diversity talk. All of this social justice rhetoric in order to sheepdog a significant proportion of the U.S. population into supporting the Democratic Party. Its new Democrat leaders determined to be once more the party of war, just as they had determined to be the party of free trade and the party of law and order. Under this cover, Obama destabilized Syria and Libya, continued the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, expanded the use of drones and bombing sites worldwide, and crucially, the United States used Ukraine as a proxy in a new Cold War with Russia. Democrats became deeply embedded in Ukrainian affairs. Hillary Clinton was set to succeed Obama and continue the project. A Clinton presidency would also bury the corruption. Enter Donald Trump. Donald Trump was a nightmare for the establishment. He came in saying he wanted to end permanent war, end regime change wars. Standing alongside Republican candidates for president in the Republican primary, he told them to their faces that George W. Bush lied them into war. He took what they thought was the orthodoxy and smashed it. Speaking for millions, he rebelled against cultural pluralism and identity politics. He warned about the problem of Islamization in the West. He warned about the problems of globalization and mass immigration, what it was doing to workers and what it was doing to national integrity. And he sought rapprochement with Russia. He threatened to undo everything the global elite were working on. And he reflected a transatlantic populist wave of rejection of the transnationalization project, the denationalization of countries. From the very beginning, the establishment began investigating and spying on Trump. We know that a FISA court was corrupted by an FBI agent who doctored emails to obtain a warrant to surveil the Trump campaign. The establishment sought to implicate Trump in Russia's attempt to steer the United States election. In the end, the Russia investigation turned up nothing. The president was not a Russian agent. They then turned to Ukraine, but they didn't just turn to Ukraine. Trump holding up aid to the Ukrainian government and demanding an investigation into Democratic Party activities threatened to unravel the ruse. The establishment, with the help of the corporate media, has been on the offense for years, and not just against Trump. They sabotaged the Bernie Sanders campaign as well. Sanders is also a populist. You may have wondered why Adam Schiff, the congressman pushing the impeachment and conducting the trial in the Senate, spends so much time talking about Ukraine and Russia. That's because this is what this is about. The Democrats have reclaimed Cold War liberalism from the Republicans. Or more accurately, the establishment has switched back to the Democratic Party as the Republicans have moved towards populism. Adam Schiff is all in, saying during the impeachment trial, quote, as one witness put it during our impeachment inquiry, the United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here. He believes we're at war with Russia. This is because in his world we are. Schiff also said, the president's misconduct cannot be decided at the ballot box, for we cannot be assured that the vote will be fairly won. This rhetoric represents a bid for legislative tyranny. The establishment believes democracy produces the wrong results, just as the elite in the United Kingdom believed about Brexit. Elites loathe democracy. They loathe the popular will. Trump, in their eyes, is illegitimate because he's not an establishment figure, because they couldn't manipulate the public into voting for Hillary Clinton. Legislative tyranny is what the founders of the country warned against. Why they created a powerful executive and set such a high standard in removing that president from power. Parliamentary systems work in such a way that if the prime minister does not do the bidding of the party, they remove him. In our system of government, the founders desired the office of the person who enforces the law to be elected by the people and to make it very difficult for the people's office to be manipulated by the legislature. What we are witnessing is nothing short of the establishment's attempt, because his populist and nationalist rhetoric runs contrary to their progressive and globalist policy objectives, to either remove the president or to wound him to such an extent that he does not win re-election in 2020. They want to return the powerful office of the presidency to the neoconservative consensus.